or good morning, everybody, depending from where you're connecting from. We are thrilled to see so many of you connected to the webinar today. Today's session is the first one of a series of UN System Staff College Coffee Hour webinars on climate security as part of the Berlin Climate Security Conference, Part 2, in partnership with adelphi and with the Climate Security Mechanism. Our common thread throughout the course of this webinar series will be sustaining peace as an integrated lens of analysis for our discussions on the impacts of climate-related risks on peace and security. With the Sustaining Peace agenda, the Secretary General has placed conflict prevention at the top of his priorities, recognizing that conflict is fueled by a variety of overlapping factors, including, for example, climate change. While there is no causal link between climate change and conflict, there is growing evidence that climate-related risks can exacerbate conflict dynamics, converging with other shocks and pressures to threaten stability of states and societies. Climate change impacts inhibit peace by undermining human security and increasing the impact of other drivers of conflict and fragility. Where institutions and governments are unable to absorb or manage climate-related stressors, risk of instability will increase. This is why it is essential that sustaining peace interventions start from a comprehensive analysis of climate-related risks and adopt an integrated framework, integrating adaptation and peace-building approaches into climate-sensitive decision-making and programming. The aim of this session today is to discuss how data can support integrated analysis and response to climate-related security risks to inform stronger policy decision-making through examples from experts who will concentrate on the Arab region. As you are all aware, during the past decade, advances in information technology have had a dramatic impact on how we confront a range of world challenges and ignited a revolution in policy decision-making. The question we would therefore like to ask to our panelists today is, can we use data analytics on climate-sensitive risks to predict the next conflicts? But before I introduce the speakers and I leave the floor to them to answer to this question, I would like to remind all the participants to this webinar to turn off their sound and their videos. There will be a chance to ask questions to the panelists through the Zoom chat box. So I will invite you from the beginning of this webinar to ask your questions as they come through, and there will be a chance to address them to our panelists in the second half of the webinar. So I would like to introduce you to Carol Kushani-Sherfan, who's the Chief Water Resources Section, Climate Change and Natural Resource Sustainability Cluster of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. I would like to introduce you also to Mr. Owen Derbyshire, who is researcher with Conflict and Environment Observatory. I would also like to introduce you to Danish Masood, Political Affairs Officer with the Innovation Cell, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and also to our colleague Alison, who is a Senior Advisor for DPPA Innovation Cell. Now, without further ado, Carol, the floor is yours, and I wish to all participants a very fruitful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me see if I can get the presentation to be shared. Thank you to Staff College for the opportunity to talk with you today. I think it's visualized okay? Yes?
Yes, Carol, maybe we don't hear you so well. Could you approach your mic a little bit more? Thank you so much.
Sure. I'm happy to speak with you today about some work that ESCO, which is a regional commission serving the Arab states, about work we've been doing on regional risk assessments and vulnerability within the context of climate change under a RECAR initiative. And I'd like to present to you then some ideas and lessons learned about the science policy interface based on that ongoing work. So to begin with, to provide some context, and again, I'm talking to you from Beirut, where there's always dynamics happening, but at least to see the trend lines here, we see that conflicts in the Arab region have been unfortunately increasing over time, be it from the middle of the century. You can see slope going up about the increase of interstate conflicts and international conflicts, or when we see trends related to monthly incidents of conflicts in the region. And this increase has been significant since actually the 2003 Gulf War, and with the onslaught of the Arab Spring in 2010. So it was around that time actually when we thought, when the Arab Spring began and the Syrian crisis, that there was a lot of introduction by the peace and security community thinking about the relationship between drought, conflict, what is the causality, is it direct, is it indirect, etc. And what was interesting to find is the increased awareness in those outside the environmental box about the relationship and the potential relationship between climate and security, as well as the use of different tools and geospatial analysis. And this is something, this map is by Prio, a partner of ours working with us on a risk assessment framework for the Arab region, showing disaggregated data sets on violent conflict in the region. This is mine because we'll visit at the end. What's important though to think about is while policy and thinking about the science policy, thinking about climate security needs to be informed by science, we also have to think that science needs to be informed by policy. And what happened in the Arab region, there was not any awareness, or let's say not consensus at a regional level to talk about climate change until 2007. And then there was a multiplier effect, beginning again, we're just talking about 15 years ago or so, that various sectors became engaged in the topic and more aware. Even the water security strategy for the region adopted in 2020 has a whole chapter related to climate change. But while there was awareness a decade ago about climate change, there was a resistance to use available data. And in order to convince policymakers and the public about the importance of this, in order to identify it as an issue for consideration in development planning and peace and security studies, there had to be some framework for making this a regional dimension that they felt over ownership. And that's why all the intergovernmental councils that I just showed, Council of Ministers of Water, Met Services, Agriculture, asked for actually work to be done, because what was available globally was not allowing a comprehensive story about the Arab region and the impacts of climate across all the states. Some states had analysis at the country level, but the region was not able to compare these apples and oranges to understand. So we went from what was available globally, and this actually, these regional reference periods are still being used by the IPCC, to setting up actually in 2012 an Arab domain that allowed regional climate modeling to be downscaled specifically for the Arab region and framed in a way that did not only cover the countries, but also the headwaters, the Tigris Euphrates, the Nile, the pressures even coming out from the Indian Ocean that was affecting Oman, all that framework providing a domain where we could assess what the climate change impacts were biophysically on the region. And that's that Arab domain adopted in 2011. So from that, we were able to inform what the impacts of climate might be on the region and projecting it across two scenarios adopted and prepared under the IPCC, the RCP 4.5 scenario, which is a moderate, and RPC 8.5, which is a higher end emission scenario, or business as usual scenario, some might call. And we were able to use that data, and a lot of the information that we were sharing to help inform policy and progress was actually focused on just two indicators. That's what people were asking for in the beginning, temperature and precipitation. But I'm very pleased that in the last few years that there's been much more awareness, and I signal this to the audience engaged that might not be so much part of the climate story, but more on the policy and peace security story, that precipitation and temperature are just one indicator. There's a range of instruments available that could really help to identify where are the troubleshoots in the region. I signal the importance of extreme climate indices that can provide things like hot days, summer days, consecutive dry days when we think about drought. We even prepared a specific indicator for the Arab region about the number of days above 40 degrees Celsius, because no one was thinking about that globally. And we needed something regionally to show how in Iraq and Kuwait and the Gulf, even in Sudan, temperatures very often exceed the 45, 50 mark. And how are we going to then show that to be able to respond and deal with the pressures that might deal with vulnerability? Also the seasonal dimension, I just a placeholder there to think that the seasons also have an effect. We're hearing right now about the terrible floods in Sudan. It is right in the middle of the flood season there. And to not only think about averages when we think of figures for informing action, but also think of disaggregated data and temporally and sectorally and geographically when we look at how to frame issues. So the Staff College had put forward the idea of the importance of integrated assessments, and this was an issue seized by the RICAR initiative that I coordinate for the Arab region in partnership with a dozen regional partners to assess not only what climate change means for the region in terms of the straight exposure indicators, but what it also means for vulnerability. And what we prepared was an integrated assessment that incorporates exposure, but also links it to the sensitivity of the exposure to those climate pressures caused by, generated and found through the projections and that are anticipated, and sectors to have an integrated vulnerability assessment that then can be used to see what the trouble spots are, and the comparative vulnerabilities across Arab sector floods and people. And just to look a little bit more detail, I hope you're able to hear me. The internet is acting up, okay. Just to show a little bit more detail that again, vulnerability, when we think of the climate change impact assessments, this is just the exposure part here. We also have to think about the range of their capacity indicators, such as knowledge and awareness, technology, institutions, infrastructure.
Hi, Carol.
Economic indicators such as GDP and equity. Can you hear me?
Yeah, your sound is breaking. Maybe if you turn the camera off, the sound might be better.
Stop video. Okay, I'm almost done. There's only a couple more slides. So what I wanted to revert back to then is the slide that we showed before that shows in 2012 where violent conflict was seen in the region. And just to show you that the reference period used for a vulnerability assessment, you see some areas that are quite comparable here. So the reference period that we used for conducting our assessment of vulnerability extended from 1986 to 2005. A little bit before 2012, but it has a consistency. So when we think about climate security, we have to think about the impacts and the vulnerability and also project forward so in order to prepare. So the outputs, for example, here is the reference period. We see what might happen by the end of the century for water availability, vulnerability, in addition to that stress on a 4.5 scenario. And if it's a business as usual, look at the stressors regarding water availability across the region and all the hotspots, all those red areas will be affected. And again, we see that there's hotspots that were evident from the conflict and what is anticipated and projected for water availability in the future. So what are some lessons learned drawn for this? Well, first, in order to engage stakeholders, it's very important to have a demand-driven process and to respond to their needs. It's important to consult across sectors and stakeholders. It's important to examine the scale, scope, and methodology and ensure that they are context-specific. There are methodologies, of course, that could be done across countries and regions, but within the scale and the scope that you're looking at, it's important to have something constant that people are aware of and comfortable with to inform their decision-making. Open data access in user-friendly formats. I think this has been the greatest success of our work on the regional initiative for RICAR, because we have not stuck to the science only with these NetCDF climate modeling data sets that come out, but also use ArcGIS so everyone has access and most people know how to use ArcGIS platforms to inform their analysis. It's important to inform dialogue through common assessments and, of course, to present the information in visually stimulating formats that inform policy and the public if we are going to move forward. So with that, I'd like to thank you and just extend also an appreciation to our partners at the League of Arab States and ACSED, the Swedish government, as well as the FAO, who are core partners amongst the other dozen partners that are working on this. And just to highlight, as my colleagues speak about Iraq and Yemen now, to say that while we've been working on the Arab domain, we'll have new projections available on that ricard.org knowledge hub come the beginning of next year for that Mashriq domain area that you see on the screen. So thank you very much. I'll turn it over back.
Thank you very much, Carol, for this very informative presentation highlighting how it is crucial to understand impact and the vulnerabilities when understanding the impact of climate risks. I would like now to give the floor to Danish and to Alison, who've been doing work on behalf of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs of the UN. Through their innovation cell, they've been focusing on the study of Iraq and climate-related risks. Danish and Alison, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you to the Staff College and to the Berlin Climate Security Conference. My name is Danish Masood, and with our senior advisor on imagery analysis, Alison Puccioni, I will be co-presenting our work on Iraq. And essentially, this is part of an early warning effort to anticipate future water-related unrest and conflict. We, the DPPA Innovation Cell, and I should say that the Innovation Cell represents the innovation track in the Peace and Security pillar of DPPA in particular, but we work cross-pillar. Essentially what we try to do is pilot new methods, new practices, new approaches in peace and security. So in this project, we're working with our partners at Element 84, who are a NASA subcontractor, along with Alison, who is housed at Stanford and runs Armillary Services, to create a water diminishment and displacement mapping solution to identify regions in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, Tigris-Euphrates rivers and the basin thereof, that are most susceptible to water scarcity. We've started with Iraq as a pilot, and we're working in collaboration with the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq UNAMI, as well as the DPPA Middle East Division. Our goal is to create an early warning system that combines elements of Earth observation, satellite imagery analysis, climate change, security perspectives. And what we're trying to do here is to scale our effort to model the rate of change of water presence throughout the Tigris-Euphrates riparian countries of Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey by studying population density in concert with indicators of water shortages. We're hoping to enable both UN principals as well as member states to better understand security issues and conflict potential throughout the region. The initial Iraq-focused pilot project that we're going to show you now will help illustrate district by district levels of water conflict risk while providing recommendations for policymakers as options for early action. So let me share my screen really quick so you guys can see. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. So to begin with, we're starting with, I'll just speak for 2 minutes longer and then hand over to Alison. But essentially, we're looking at a range of demand and supply indicators in order to basically create our geospatial database that Alison's going to be talking about. The indicators that we've included in our model include soil moisture, precipitation, groundwater storage. This is with the famous GRACE mission from NASA, which looks at changes in the Earth's gravitational field as a result of groundwater. Surface water extent. On the demand side, we're looking at land subsidence, by which we mean land surface elevation changes that happen as a result of the water aquifers under the ground getting depleted. Vegetation, here we can look at essentially the types of light that are absorbed and reflected and understand from that the kind of vegetation that we have on the ground, as well as population density. And we're looking at this in concert with georeferential conflict event data. For now, we've decided to go with the UCDP, which is at Uppsala University. Many of you will be familiar with that data set database. We did that because of the fact that it goes back much farther or further in history than ACLID does. This is what we're beginning with. We're of course looking at some additional stressors, including the water stress index and the drought index, in order to populate our model. And let me turn to the next slide and hand over to Allison on our approach.
Yeah, good morning. Hopefully you can see me. We have speaker view. But yeah, as Danish had mentioned, of this project where we incorporate a number of space-based indicators together has been sort of never been done to this level of detail with sort of 11 indicators over Iraq. And at the end of the day, we wanted to generate a geodatabase that would tie all of these indicators together, normalize the data so that we can look at all of it on a month-to-month basis, so we can account for seasonality, to ultimately be able to visualize this and find pain points that have the least water availability. And in fact, we began this approach by spending a number of months looking at literature reviews for other potential water security projects that were pertinent to Iraq or pertinent to water insecurity. And we really found nothing with the level of granularity that explored Iraq and mapped out these indicators that account for water supply and water demand issues as they may pertain to conflict. Carol illustrated a beautiful slide in her presentation that really show you that there is a relationship between water insecurity and conflict. We don't presume to predict conflict, although we are trying to unpack and explore how water correlates to conflict. And then we'll go to the next slide, Danish, thank you. So at this point, we are building a visualization tool, or a dashboard, if you will, user experience, that allows us to look at administrative level 1 and administrative level 2, sort of governorates and provinces within Iraq, as they pertain to all of the 11 indicators, meaning which of these small districts have water insecurity issues pertaining to soil moisture or rainfall or vegetation history. And as you can see, it allows us to look at sort of the comparison across districts, the comparison across all of the different indicators, and allows us to sort of better understand this. It, if you will, allows us to ask more questions than we were able to do before. For instance, if you have 2 straight months of lowered precipitation, how does that affect soil moisture in a particular district? Why do you see increased rainfall in Al Basra and yet you see increased conflict? We have an indicator that has to do with water quality. If you see increased rainfall, flooding to the extent, and you potentially see a higher water temperature, that actually shows us something about water availability, yet water quality has diminished. So again, our tool allows us to compare indicators, districts, and timeframes. Danish, can you go to the next slide, please? Sure. And then finally, ultimately, we want to be able to work with our policymakers to take an enormous amount of information. Again, the last time we ran the entire geodatabase, we came up with something like 145,000 points of data per district, per indicator, and per time frame. But how do we show you now where the districts are a little bit more of a pain point and where they're a little bit less of one? Ultimately, we want to be able to show the variance, which is how much it deviates from the historical averages of rainfall, and also show you the trend lines, and allows you to sort of nug down into each of the areas and sort of look at what's happening there. So this is our approach to the water insecurity. Danish, I'll hand it back to you because we've also done sort of a separate testing on conflict.
Thanks so much, Allison. And I just want to note that poor Allison has had to wake up at an ungodly hour to do this, so I'm especially thankful. She's in California. So as Allison was saying, we're working toward developing an overall conflict risk calculation that highlights districts with the highest risk of conflict due to water insecurity, aggregates all of our indicators. And in each case, exactly as Allison was saying on the last slide, we're looking at the variance from the historical average, right? In order to do this, we basically, our very brilliant engineers at Element 84 have been designing an algorithm that looks at patterns between water diminishment and historical conflict events. And we're looking at, as I said earlier, significant variances from historical averages for a given time span. That's how we're doing it. And, you know, again, I want to stress what Ginevra was saying earlier, that, you know, for those of you who are the causal inference heads in the audience, obviously, you know, we're not trying to establish causal inference. We're just looking at correlation over time and seeing what patterns emerge. But this is an area of development. This is an area where, while there is some literature on water conflict, as well as an interesting range of literature on cooperation around water resources as well, we would very much welcome audience comments here and to think about how we might further complexify our model. Back to Alison to talk about challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, we are beginning to see correlations between decreases in water availability and increases in conflict, as Carol showed you in her slide a little bit earlier. But we're exploring how to accurately understand these relationships. And we do believe that water is a precursor to increased conflict, but there are so many other factors involved. And it unfortunately requires the quantitative analysis over the region, but it also requires acute research to help us unpack and understand sort of all the other potential problems that have to do with this. And as Donish had mentioned, this is very much a pilot project, and we have spent a lot of time choosing the indicators that we believe are pertinent to understanding conflict and water insecurity in the region. But we are also able to add other indicators and sort of modify this agile database in the future as we move forward. GDP, poverty, population density we are already looking at, and sort of bisecting out water insecurity in a populated area versus water insecurity in a rural area, and how do these factors come into play. So this is sort of the challenge in the future of what we're doing. And at this point, as Donish had mentioned, we're really in the process of trying to, if you will, raise the test balloon to a number of experts in the field so that we can gather feedback and incorporate it into our final product. And then finally, as Donish had mentioned, if we move forward, ultimately our product is to provide our policymakers on the ground who may or may not be so interested in highly sensitive satellite data information, to tell them this is an area that could potentially benefit from a bit of water security management and intervention. And with that, Donish, I'll bring it back to you.
Just to say thank you again to our colleagues, and you know, I will now return to geostationary orbit. Back to Ginevra.
Thank you very much, Danish and Alison, for also highlighting the importance of looking at patterns and correlation as opposed to causal links. I would like now to turn to Hyogan, who will talk us through an example from his research in Yemen. Hyogan, the floor is yours. You may turn on your camera. Thank you.
Brilliant. So thanks for the opportunity to speak and for the other speakers. So I am Owen Derbyshire. I work for a small charity in the UK, the Conflict and Environment Observatory. And it's kind of exciting to talk here about something lots of people are very interested in. So the kind of theme of the workshop was to answer the question, can big data predict conflicts? And as the other speakers have kind of alluded to, all of these various elements have so many complicated interconnections. The blunt answer is no, especially when you consider black swan events. So perhaps a more reasonable question is, to what extent can environmental data inform security risk? And when I talk about environmental data here, I mean not just biophysical data, or climate variables, but also data on natural resources, on pollution, and on critical environmental infrastructure.
Risk categories. Yep.
Now, this is an attractive area of study because of the masses of environmental data which now exists, be that observations or model predictions, and the probability exists, as we've just seen, to kind of nowcast or forecast locations of significant environmental stress and define a vulnerability warning. And in theory, this could be done at a regional, state, or community scale, and would result in some type of peace-building intervention. However, for this approach to be successful, there are two fundamental ingredients, and understanding these kind of forms the basis of my job at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. So the first ingredient is that we need robust and validated data at appropriate resolutions, and ideally with long and complementary historical time series. Number two is that we need correct interpretations of how environment and conflict have interacted in the past and the present across a range of regions, environments, and political, social, and economic situations. This is in order to best inform what metrics are most important, where and when. But this analysis is very multifaceted, but necessary to avoid overcausation, as we've already talked about. And in fact, perhaps it's more important to perhaps only study areas where environmental stress hasn't led to conflicts. So with ingredient number one, we're in a good but not a perfect position. However, for number two, we still aren't there yet, and more research is required. One obvious example being the role of climate change in the Arab Spring is still an ongoing source of debate. In this presentation, I will briefly show how some environmental change in a small but important breadbasket of Yemen shows the complexity involved and difficulty in unpicking the narrative, even with the benefit of hindsight. So to briefly introduce the area we're looking at, we're on the Red Sea coastal plain in the west of Yemen, just south of Hodeidah, for those familiar with the region. So this is like a dry and arid agricultural area where the farmland runs mainly alongside wadis, which are dry riverbeds most of the year, but provide seasonal water for irrigation, capture and storage. This is known as spate agriculture and was historically the main water source before kind of larger scale groundwater abstraction was introduced in the 1980s, and that's been used to farm water intensive cash crops like bananas and mangoes. Also in the 70s and 80s, the spate system was modernised by World Bank funded projects with traditional diversion structures replaced. This had the effect of disrupting the flow rate and resulting in a maintenance burden the local governments couldn't fulfil, and also an unequal distribution of spate water. So it's already a source of local conflicts before going into the international conflicts. So from monitoring of vegetation changes from space during the conflict in Yemen, we found that nearly half the cropland area in Wadis Zabid and Rima is in distress, and that's about 750 kilometers squared. So we don't have the time here to go into all the detail, but very briefly on the map on the screen now, the areas in red are the areas where agriculture is in distress. And we can be pretty confident of these observations because they corroborate ground testimony, government statistics, and independent remote sensing data. So the immediate assumption might be that the direct conflict in Yemen has played a large role. This might be true going forward, but it's not the case historically, because if we now overlay the locations of violent incidents from the ACLED database, specifically targeting agricultural and water targets, we can see that pretty much all the incidents have occurred in the last 18 months. So the question is how we go about understanding what's happened in Wadis Zabid and Rima. And the answer is as much data as possible. And we kind of got that impression from the last talk. We need as much as possible. And we need to present that in a complementary way. So here we show it as a time series. So we don't have time to go into great depth here, but as you can see, we've got open source data for an array of environmental, economic, and humanitarian metrics. Now, these data sources all have their own uncertainties and issues, particularly with differences in spatial and temporal resolutions, gaps in the data, or a latency in availability. So these are all issues to think about when developing kind of robust environment security products. So the question is, can we use this data to try and work out what's happened here? Well, first of all, we can see most of the damage has occurred in 2014, 15, and 16. And to begin with, we can kind of disregard extreme weather events, which kind of summarised in the plot below. There weren't any kind of at that point. Although there were some in the preceding years, perhaps reducing resilience. It's that we can kind of see that changes in that are consistent with changes in known economic shocks. First of all, in 2011, kind of associated with the Yemeni revolutions, the groundwater levels were falling, but suddenly that falling groundwater reverses and they start to increase again. And this is correlated with a drop in agricultural area. However, the interpretation is a little bit confusing. It's confounded by an increase in precipitation at the same time. And then again, we see a similar effect in 2014 and 2015, both with the loss of diesel subsidies to begin with, and then when the conflict became internationalized and the Saudi-led coalition intervened. There's price hikes in diesel and a total inability to pump groundwater. So this totally inhibited people's ability to farm agriculture and led to widespread abandonments. And we can see this in agricultural data, in nightlight data, both from space and from official sources. So this is a kind of very oversimplified hypothesis as to what's happened in the area. And there remain large uncertainties, partly from the data and partly from our interpretation. And given these difficulties, which are echoed across Yemen, where the similar kind of drivers are all happening but operating in different directions, causing different reactions, my open question to this workshop is if the kind of current generation of climate or environmental security indices could have kind of foreseen this environmental loss, or indeed what it could tell us about the future in this particular area, which is currently a very active conflict with even reports of trench warfare over farms. And then on top of that, we have COVID, a black swan event, which has complicated matters further. Another question is how these analytics could help inform which environmental peacebuilding interventions could be made and how we could ensure that they were good ones. For example, in this region, there are currently solar panels being provided by international donors with the express purpose of pumping groundwater for agriculture. But based on our kind of hypothesis, you could argue this is a bad intervention and one continuing a fundamentally unsustainable practice, entrenching inequalities and just storing up more problems for the future. So to just sum up, if I kind of return to the two ingredients I mentioned earlier, we are in fairly good shape with the data availability and the data we've got, although there is still more to be done. For instance, assimilating more non-biophysical environmental data. For example, in Yemen, this might be on the failing wastewater and solid waste treatment systems, which are in themselves linked to cholera outbreaks and so on. And incorporating local knowledge is critical, but beset with difficulty in these fragile contexts because mistrust and suspicion is high. We're actively looking towards citizen science, actually, and hosted a session on it this morning at the European Citizen Science Conference. So that's an interesting future direction. But what I would argue is that we could be in a much better place with ingredient number 2, understanding how past and current conflicts are intertwined or not with environmental change. And this is needed to properly inform analytical approaches when generating risks or conflict warnings. And it was nice to hear Alice and Denise kind of saying this is a similar thing. But currently this kind of area is quite a niche field, kind of lying outside the scope of academia and maybe big international organizations, and really more research is needed. And we're kind of trying to strive to do that here at the Conflicts and Environment Observatory, but we are kind of limited a bit between just 5 of us on legal policy and advocacy as well data. But more work is needed. I'll leave it there. Sorry. There we go.
Thank you so much again for this very interesting presentation, and also for reframing the initial question that we posed to you panelists: can big data predict conflicts? And that the better question would be, to what extent can environmental data inform security risk? And even making the link, how can we do environmental peace building or peace building that causes no harm but includes also consideration for climate security risks? We have received a number of questions here in the chat box, so I would invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and be ready for a few questions that we have received. So yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to answer Anouk questions, and if that was clear enough, I'm also happy to repeat it, or we can ask Anouk to rewrite it for us. Carol, would you like to maybe go ahead?
Sure. I mean, infrastructure, again, the selection of indicators as proposed vulnerability. And there's either the resistance of the infrastructure in terms of being able to bear the brunt. That is one storyline, a very engineering feasibility climate proofing story. Or if you're looking at infrastructure and the ability of a community to cope with the pressure, where that would be indicators such as access to water or water storage or ecosystems or healthcare facilities, other types of infrastructure. So really you have to define your question as to which you are more interested in. And the amount of detail you have will depend on the scope. Obviously, you can get a lot more detailed if you're working at a country or municipal level, because you can have field work versus a regional when you have to have indicators selected that are able to have at least an 85–90% representation across a variety of countries. So that's something to think about when you're doing analysis on infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Does anybody want to complement, or anybody from the panel? Okay. I see no reaction from the floor, so then I will go on to the next question. We have received from Carolina Matamoros. Do you have an indicator that reflects the vulnerability of the population? Something like unsatisfied basic needs could strengthen some unseen variables, which kind of is a segue to the previous question that Carol was answering. Anybody wants to take this question? Danish, yeah, and I saw also Alison.
No, I think Alison. Yes, first of all, we would love to take the question, and Alison, maybe I'd love to defer to Alison on this, because this is something we've thought a lot about.
Right. We have not incorporated the unsatisfied basic needs, but this is sort of something that we're trying to work towards. And then sort of to continue forward, we're in the middle of unpacking some of the indicators that we believe might be the most pertinent. So we don't know the answer to that, but we do know the question, and our early studies are telling us that, in fact, it might be precipitation. If there's a long prolonged diminishment in precipitation, we think that might be one significant factor of increase of potential likelihood for conflict. So we are very, very careful about talking about correlations, not causations. And we do need to, in answer to the question directly, we do need to move forward with trying to incorporate a number of more indicators into our project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alison. Any other reactions from the floor? Okay, I see no more reactions. So there's actually a very interesting question from Lucille Martins. And the question is on the role of discourses, of narratives. So her question is, how do you account for the role of discourses on both water resources and conflicts? See, for instance, the work of Naum Miromachi assessing how security discourses on transboundary river basins impact the perception of stakeholders and policymakers and shape political tensions. I see a number of you moving. I don't know if, yeah, Carol, please. Your mic is off, Carol. You might want to. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Actually, that question is right on, because one of the reasons that we actually started working on the regional assessment for the impact of climate change, specifically on water in the Arab region, and then linking it into the socioeconomic vulnerability, is that the request actually came, yes, the need for more information from the environment side, but the people who were most concerned, the ministries, were the water ministries. They were concerned of what happens with the headwaters of the water for the shared water. 66% of water, freshwater, surface water resources in the Arab region is across one or more boundaries. And that does not mean outside of the Arab region. That includes water across, let's say, Syria and Jordan. That's transboundary as much as Turkey and Iraq. So the issue of having a common knowledge base, such as what we were trying, the knowledge gap we were filling, to provide a baseline of understanding and common information that different countries who have different capacities and different access to data and different situations can have a baseline to talk on, and even not only for the assessments, but even the data that is used. And there is differences in technical capacity across countries. So you really have to think about providing a level playing field to allow different countries who share basins to have adequate access to information to at least start up that conversation. So again, very important to think of climate change, transboundary water together, especially for our region.
Thank you very much, Carol. Any other reactions from our panelists? Okay, if there's no more reactions, there is a question for Hyogan from Marie. Hyogan, did you combine the quantitative analytics with qualitative data in order to get a deeper understanding of the links?
Yeah, essentially that's exactly what we've done. We've got the really qualitative stuff, quantitative stuff from Earth observations, satellite remote sensing, model outputs. Yeah, we kind of combined that with the more qualitative stuff from kind of humanitarian organizations, ground reports, social media, and by kind of bringing those two together and trying to do that in a kind of sensible way, the idea is that we can try and build a narrative over exactly what has happened, and you're kind of joining up the top down and bottom up together. And that's the kind of general idea of our whole approach. And I think that's important when thinking about these indices, not to forget to include, or to include things that come from the bottom up as well.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or additions to Hyogan on from your experiences with Ashwa or in Iraq? Okay, if there's no additions, there is another questions that we have received from Christoph Hodder from Somalia. And his question is, it would be great to get help on analyzing the data in a more simpler way that could help creating a more policy level analysis. And how can we move away from trying to make the link between climate and security into how do we implement this, and what is the ultimate goal of data around climate and security? There is three big questions here. I don't know if any of you wants to start. Yeah, Carol, please.
Poor Chris is actually probably commenting because we're just exchanging on data sets, and I think I overwhelmed him. So very good to see you online. This is what was the concern. We can use, and actually when we started the vulnerability assessment, the inspiration was a very 6-indicator prong assessment that had been done by Adelphi actually in Botswana. But it depends on the depth and if you want to have all those different dynamics included. I mean, we can't just say temperature and conflict are related. I don't think that is sufficiently, it doesn't provide enough of a correlation. There has to be a value, an impact chain, or a way that we correlate direct, indirect, the capacity of the community to address. But there is ways to simplify it if you know the question that needs to be asked. So if you're very clear on the question that you're trying to ask, or at least the stakeholder that is, that is being targeted. I mean, is it the farmer? Is it the agricultural sector? Is it a minister? Is it transboundary where you want knowledge at a larger scale? Having a very clear question then can help drive the indicators and the information to at least close the box a little bit on the range of data that is available. And when we talk satellites, I'm sure, I mean, it's just massive what is available with remote sensing. So I'll let my colleagues mention that.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. And I don't see any further questions from the floor and from the participants, but I wonder whether, as panelists, you have some final reflections to share with our audience today.
Ginevra, can I do a two-finger to Carol's statement? If I may, just from a logistical perspective, when the Innovation Cell mandated this project originally, they built an entire phase of the project just to sort of translate all of the satellite data, all of the 150,000 data points within Iraq to the policymakers, right? Ultimately, our product isn't, a 150,000 row spreadsheet. It's a policy recommendation. And then if they wanted to unpack exactly why we are proposing this, they have all of the information at their disposal to do so. But the bottom line is we have to separate the wheat from the chaff, and we have to, at the end of the day, say there are potentially acute issues within this region, and here are the reasons and the methods behind this statement. Thanks.
Thanks, that's very helpful, Alison. Any other comments before we wrap up this session? Yes, Danish. And then I see.
Yeah, just to add to what Alison, well, just to add maybe a few comments on some of the questions that have been raised, and then maybe something to my colleagues, which I imagine will continue to debate even after this whole session. One is that to add to what Alison is saying is that we also need to kind of figure out ways to customize whatever policy recommendations we make per the target demographic that we're working with, right? So if we're looking at governor level administration, governors essentially in a country like Iraq, how, what are the ways in which we can, tailor the recommendations that make sense, right? And then also while this work, everything we've done is open source, there's also the whole information ethics question that I keep raising, which is, in a country where there's an unfortunate history of forced relocation and attempts at ethnic cleansing, how do we make sure that we don't arm the wrong actors with information that will then facilitate more, war crimes, right? Where if they find out that water diminishment is particularly high in a region where a group that they identify with resides and it's low and where some minority group resides, is there a risk of forced displacement of the other group, et cetera, especially when there are armed actors involved. So that's also something we need to consider in how we address the policy issue. It's complicated. And then, the other thing is for us is to find simple ways to talk about our methodology, find simple ways to talk about the extent to which we believe it is accurate, what the holes might be, to talk very openly about our failures. I don't think, we've been kind of beating this drum in the innovation cell for the peace and security pillar to become much more evidence-based for years, right? Both in the group that was the proto-innovation cell as well as now the innovation cell exists inside of DPPA. So but we also have to put a mirror in front of ourselves and understand that there are limits. To the point about narratives, Carol answered it perfectly. I would just add that those kinds of narratives and discourses really, really matter, particularly in an area like the Middle East, where you have, significant risk of interstate tensions and conflict, particularly from countries that are upstream. How are those resources managed well? How do we foster regional thinking? How do we try to de-escalate tensions? Using narratives of cooperation rather than conflict. This is really hard work, and it's the work of diplomacy. And kudos to our SRSGs in the region that are at it. The final thing that I want to say very quickly from my side is that the whole link to conflict. I mean, our colleagues here have said really wonderful things about what we can and what we can't say. But even when looking at correlation. And talking about different risk classes, which is what we really can do, right? It's not so straightforward always, right? Which data set do we use? Do we believe in georeferential conflict event data sets? Are they all accurate? Are they mostly, what is the basis? Are they mostly based on news reports? What are the limits of that? So, I mean, this is something that's going to continue to be refined over the next few years. And there's a lot of potential for growth and development. And that's why it's interesting for us to, talk to folks inside the community, because I'm hoping at least that even if we don't do it in the context of our Q&A now, that it results in a kind of conversation, at least online, about what works and what doesn't work, or what's something worth exploring. Thanks again for having us.
Thank you very much, Danish. I saw here again has his hands raised earlier. I don't know if you still, yes. Please.
Yeah, I'll just quickly echo what Denise was saying there. I think it's important to recognize this is incredibly complex. There are very large uncertainties, and don't be afraid of being open with the truth and telling people this is uncertain. and being open with the way you got there, because I think, yeah, the rising threat of kind of the weaponization of disinformation, and also the rise of disinformation and kind of environmental climate data as a weapon, that's a real kind of prospect. So we need to be open in terms of what has happened and why it is complicated and what are the uncertainties.
Thank you very much. Any other reactions or comments from the floor, or we can start wrapping up this session? Yes, Carol, please.
Just really quick, when the issue about all the data and what the use is, I think there's also the fundamental larger issue on how we perceive the future to be. So when we're assessing also all the data sets and all the ways of assessing, identifying indicators that are now, we also have to think, okay, well, are we projecting into 10 years, the SDGs? Are we projecting to mid-century? Are we looking into the rights of the future generations? Because the way that a government or the public perceives what the future may bring based on our current actions will also change dramatically what information is provided. I mean, there's significant differences if it's this 8.5 business as usual and moderate scenario. You get different figures, and you have to explain, well, what is the government, or what is your perception as to how the future is? And those assumptions, not only indicators, but the assumptions you place are very important for deciding, for informing decision maker. And I would only say the projections, but also how you perceive the ability of man, of people, I'm definitely not the one, of humans to react. I mean, do we think we are 50-50, biophysical and our adaptive capacity is equal? Are we fatalists, or are we optimists that we can overcome what's ahead? So these are fundamental, you might think it's philosophy, but it changes the entire data set and how you analyze if those fundamentals are not established to move forward.
Thank you very much, Carol. This is a beautiful segue to the sort of wrapping up, because ultimately we can use all the data sets we want, but it really focuses on the importance of asking the right questions, looking at what is the impact that we would like to achieve. What are we talking about in terms of vulnerable communities, vulnerable issues, and also then if we cannot talk about causal relationships, as my initial questions on can data predict conflict, then what can we talk about, and what patterns do we need to look into, and then of course the need to rephrase this question and to use data perhaps to accompany an assessment of the different risks and security concerns. So I would like to thank you very much, all of you, because I mean these discussions have been really interesting and also very lively, and the number of participants who have joined us from the beginning and stayed with us to the end is a testament to that. So I would like to thank all of our panelists and all of the participants for being with us and asking these very important questions on timely issues. And I would like to invite you also to the next coffee hour webinar as part of the Berlin Climate Security Conference. We have a series of 4 webinars. This one was the first. The second one will be at 3 p.m. Central European Time, and we will focus on on gender and climate securities, looking at different vulnerabilities according to the different gender groups. So please follow us next week. Thank you again. Thank you, Danish, Carol, Alison, and Helgen for being with us.